Hello everyone, it's Miss Hinde-Taylor here, ready to read chapter 12 of Half a King. I hope you all had a lovely Easter. Anyway, just a bit of a recap. Prince Yarvi has been made a slave after being betrayed by his uncle, and now he's vowed to take his revenge and take back the crown. So, chapter 12, The Minister's Tools. Stroke by back-breaking stroke, Thulby and home and Yarvi's old life slipped into the past. Southwards dragged the south wind, though the wind rarely seemed to blow her or slaves much help. Southwards down the ragged coast of Getland with its islands and inlets, its walled villages and fishing boats bobbing on the tide, its fenced farmsteads on sheep-dotted hillsides. And on went Yarvi's pitiless, sinew-shredding, tooth-grinding war against the oar. He could not have said he was winning. No one won. But perhaps his defeats were not quite so one-sided. Samael brought them tight to the coast as they passed the mouth of the Helm River, and the ship began to hum with muttered prayers. The oarsmen cast fearful glances out to sea towards a spiral of blackened cloud that tore the sky. They could not see the splintered elf towers on the broken islands beneath it, but everyone knew they lurked behind the horizon. Strockham, muttered Yarvi, straining to see and fearing to see at once. In ages past men had brought relics from that cursed elf ruin, but in their triumph they had sickened and died, and the ministry had forbidden any man to go there. Father, peace protect us, grunted Rolf, making a shambles of holy symbols over his heart, and the slaves needed no whip to double their efforts and leave that shadow far in their wake. The irony was not lost on Yarvi that this was the very route he would have taken to his minister's test. On that voyage, Prince Yarvi, swaddled in a rich blanket with his books, would have spared no thought for the suffering of the oar slaves. Now, chained to the benches, he made the south wind his study, the ship and the people on it, and how he might use them to get free of it. For people are the minister's best tools, Mother Gundring always said. Abdul Arik Shidikshrim, self-renowned merchant, lover and naval captain, spent most of her time drunk, and most of the rest passed out drunk. Sometimes her snoring could be heard through the door of her cabin in the aft castle, eerily keeping time to the movement of the rowers. Sometimes she would stand upon the forecastle in melancholy mood, one hand on her slouched hip and the other clutching a half-empty bottle, frowning into the wind, as though daring it to blow harder. Sometimes she would prowl the gangway, slapping backs and telling jokes as though she and her slaves were old friends together. When she passed the nameless deck scrubber, she would never miss a chance to kick, throttle, or append the night bucket over him. Then she would swig from her wine and roar out, "On to profits!" and the oarsmen would cheer, and the man who cheered especially loudly might get a taste of the captain's wine himself, and a man who stayed silent might get a taste of Trigg's whip instead. Trigg was the overseer, the chain master, the grip, second in command and with a full share in the enterprise. He ordered the guards, perhaps 24 of them, and watched over the slaves and made sure they kept whatever the pace the captain asked for. He was a brutal man, but there was a kind of awful justice in him. He had no favourites and made no exceptions. Everyone was whipped alike. Ankram was the storekeeper, and there was no justice in him at all. He slept below decks with the stores, and was the only slave to be regularly let off the ship. It was his task to buy food and clothes and share them out, and he worked 1,000 tiny swindles every day, buying meat that was halfway spoiled and trimming every man's rations, and making them mend clothes that were worn to rags and splitting the profits with Trigg. Whenever he passed by Rolf, he would spit with particular disgust. "What does that crooked bastard want with money?" "Some men simply like money," said Giles mildly. "Even slaves? Slaves have the same appetites as other men. It's the chance to indulge them they lack." "True enough," said Rolf, looking wistfully up at Smail. The navigator spent most of her time on the roof of one of the castles, checking charts and instruments, or frowning up at the sun or stars while she worked quick sums on her fingers, or pointing out some rock or ripple, some cloud or current, and snapping out warnings. While the south wind was at sea, she went where she pleased, but when they came into dock, the captain's first act was always to lock her by a long, fine chain to an iron ring on the aft castle. A slave with her skills was probably worth more than their whole cargo. Sometimes she threaded among the rowers, clambering heedlessly over men, oars and benches to pick at some fixing or other, or to lean over the ship's side to check debts with a knotted plumb line. The only time Yarvi ever saw her smile was when she was perched on one of the mastheads, with the wind tearing at her short hair, as happy there as Yarvi might have been at Mother Gundring's fire pit, scanning the coast through a tube of bright brass. It was Throvenland that ground by now, grey cliffs besieged by the hungry waves, grey beaches where the sea sucked at the shingle, grey towns where grey-mailed spearmen frowned from the wharves of passing ships. My home was near here, said Rolf, as they shipped the oars one grey morning, a thin drizzle beading everything with dew. 2 days' hard ride inland. I had a good farm with a good stone chimney and a good wife who bore me 2 good sons. Well, how did you end up here? Asked Yarvi, fiddling pointlessly at the strapping on his raw left wrist. I was a fighting man, an archer, sailor, swordsman and raider in the summer months. Rolf scratched at his heavy jaw, already grey-stubbled, for his beard seemed to spring out an hour after it was shaved. I served a dozen seasons with a captain called Halston, an easy-going fellow. I became his helmsman, along with Hopkey Strangletoes and Blue Jenner and some other handy men. We enjoyed some successes in the raiding business, enough that I could sit with my feet to the fire and drink good ale all winter. Ale never agreed with me, but it sounds a happy life, said Gerald, gazing into the far distance, towards a happy past of his own, perhaps. The gods love to laugh at a happy man. Rolf noisily gathered some spit and sent it spinning over the side of the ship. One winter, somewhat the worse for drink, Halston fell from his horse and died, and the ship passed to his oldest son, young Halston, who was a different kind of man, all pride and froth and scant wisdom. Sometimes father and son aren't much alike, muttered Yarvi. Against my better judgment, I consented to be his helmsman, and not a week from port, ignoring my advice, he tried to take a too well-guarded merchant ship. Hopkey and Jenner and most of the rest were through the last door that day. That means they died. I was one among a handful taken prisoner and sold on. That was 2 summers ago, and I've been pulling an oar for Trig ever since. A bitter ending, said Yarvi. Many sweet stories have them, said Gerald. Rolf shrugged. Hard to complain. In my voyages we must have stolen 10 score Englands and sold them for slaves, and taken great delight in the profits. The old raider rubbed his rough palm against the grain of the oar. They say the seed you scatter will be the seed you harvest, and so it seems indeed. You wouldn't leave if you could, muttered Yarvi, with a glance towards Trig to make sure they were not heard. Gerald snorted. There is a well in the village where I used to live, a well that gives the sweetest water in the world. He closed his eyes and licked at his lips as if he could taste it. I would give anything to drink from that well again. He spread his palms. But I have nothing to give. And look at the last man who tried to leave. And he nodded towards the scrubber, his block scraping endlessly down the deck, his heavy chain rattling as he shuffled stiffly on scabbed knees to nowhere. What's his story? Asked Yarvi. I don't know his name. Nothing, we call him. When I was first brought to the South Wind, he pulled an oar. One night, off the coast of Getland, he tried to escape. Somehow he got free of his train and stole a knife. He killed 3 guards and cut another's knee so he never walked again, and he gave our captain that scar before she. And Trig put a stop to him. Yarvi blinked at the shambling scrubber. All that with a knife? And not a large one. Trig wanted to hang him from a mast, but Shliksham chose to keep him alive as an example to the rest of us. Mercy's ever been a weakness, said Rolf, and gave a grunt of joyless laughter. She stitched her cut, said Gerald, and put that great chain on him and hired more guards, and told them never to let him get his hands upon a blade, and ever since he's been scrubbing the deck, and never since have I heard him say a word. What about you? Asked Yarvi. Gerald grinned sideways at him. I speak when I have something worth saying. No, I mean, what's your story? I used to be a baker. Ropes hissed as they brought up the anchor, and Gerald sighed and worked his hands about the handles his own palms had polished to a gleam. Now, my story is I pull this oar. That's the end of chapter 12. See you next time for chapter 13, called The Fall Strikes. Take care.